Ever play Blasphemous? Here we have yet another Metroidvania style game, this one developed by Spanish studio The Game Kitchen and published by Team 17 in September of 2019 for your Nintendo Switch, PS4, Xbox One, or Windows-based PC. Blasphemous was brought to life via a Kickstarter campaign launched in 2017. A cursory glance at the Kickstarter page reveals the developer's initial goal of only $50,000 being far surpassed. The game's opening really sets the theme for the game's world. Not so much the story, which is somewhat unclear, but the world itself. The NPCs, as well as the protagonist, known as the Penitent One, exist in the land of Custodia, a universe in which all humans are considered sinful and assumed guilty of all sin. Thus, each person has a particular penance, acting as a self-inflicted handicap which they bear for life. Like our protagonist, who has sworn a vow of silence. Or Redento, who wears a weight around his neck. Or worse, poor Deogracias here is forced to be a narrator in a video game. Dios mío! But these are some of the least extreme examples of penance found throughout the world of Custodia. There are a bunch of monsters and bosses which take on disgustingly horrific forms. To add confusion to the narrative, these monstrosities are the result of an event referred to as the Grievous Miracle. Our narrator friend Deogracias tells us himself that the miracle was an instance in which all of humanity's guilt and sin were made manifest in reality by causing deformation and mutilation to the populace. For this, the NPCs give thanks. It's really a sick, twisted game world which adds a somewhat discomforting quality to the experience. The Penitent One can run, jump, and fight. He uses a sword appropriately titled Mea Culpa, which can be upgraded several times at these Mea Culpa altars. One must spend Tears of Atonement for Mea Culpa upgrades. Tears of Atonement are the in-game currency. Everything has a weird name. Rosary beads are passive upgrades and only a limited number may be equipped at once. You can also learn prayers, which are like spells that drain your fervor, which is like magic. Relics can also be equipped, which do the same thing as the rosary beads, but you can use only 3 at once. Mea Culpa hearts are yet another kind of upgrade, adding to any accruing confusion regarding the matter. Menu madness aside, the game's art style and visuals are striking and help create a sense of disquiet. In an interview, creative director Enrique Cabeza proclaimed that the artists and architecture of Seville in southern Spain were the main inspiration for the art direction. In particular, Francisco Goya's famous painting, A Procession of Flagellants. We also can see plenty of similarity with other Goya masterpieces like The Madhouse or Saturn Devouring His Sons. Neat! Well, if you like the idea of Goya paintings being brought to life, but with the resolution of a Super Nintendo game, then Blasphemous is for you. I happen to like the pixelated visuals, and these are done really well. The developers have managed to cram an awful lot of detail into these sprites. The enemies are animated well and look good, but the game's art really shines during the boss fights. There are a number of bosses in Blasphemous, and some are completely ridiculous. Honestly, there is something about these bosses that just weirds me out. Like little Esposito here. Ugh. Eyes are bleeding and everything. Witnessing the manner in which Esposito calmly dismembers the Penitent One is especially unsettling. Or how about Our Lady of the Charred Visage? Gross. This reminds me of that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where the Nazis' faces melted after looking at the Ark of the Covenant. Fun stuff. The bosses are all pretty tough too. My experience was that the larger bosses were less difficult than their diminutive accomplices. Why? Because the smaller bosses require more precise blocking, patience, and strategy. The larger bosses are more susceptible to attacks from the less polished player. For example, Melchiades here has a bunch of arms supporting him which are easy to hit from a standing position. His mace is an easy dodge and you can do a bunch of damage once his face is near enough to the ground. And isn't he cool to look at? I mean, I know the whole picture is pretty grotesque and all, what with the hairy, bodiless arms in the foreground, and Melchiades' fleshless corpse relentlessly chewing on something imaginary. But it's very detailed and vivid, even with the earthy, dim color palette from which they worked. From that perspective, the visuals are pretty incredible. But in between the bosses are lots of other stuff, and unfortunately a lot of that other stuff isn't as exciting as the boss battles. The game world itself is quite large, comprising 21 different and mostly unique areas. Unlike other games in the genre, the player can get to just about any point on the map from the outset of the game. Aside from needing a key here and there are very few special abilities or gadgets to be found or purchased which allow the player to access new areas. Instead, new areas are uncovered simply by fighting your way through a new zone. Eventually, and somewhat formulaically, the map will work itself back towards where you started, where the player shall happen upon a ladder or lever or mechanism of some sort which allows for shorter travel in the future. No double jump or anything, just ladders and elevators. Which is okay, I just really like double jumping. Although I guess double jumping wouldn't really work in this game because the Penitent One falls like a rock, and that's part of the gameplay. In fact, falling is a big part of Blasphemous. An aspiring adventurer should expect to see their character impaled by spikes on numerous occasions. In fact, the spike usage is so great, I'm a little disappointed they couldn't add different and varying implements of impalement. Just the one set of spikes. Oh well. You will notice right away that your character gets pushed back quite a bit when hit by an enemy. One would be correct in assuming that this bounciness is increased whilst airborne, thus resulting in many deaths by spike. A very anger-inducing situation indeed, and one which resulted in frequent rage quits by this reviewer. In Dark Souls style, the player must return to the scene of their death in order to fight at full capacity. Unlike other games, the player doesn't lose gold, or Tears of Atonement, when they die, but your mana bar, fervor bar, will be depleted until you find your corpse. Perhaps fighting the same set of baddies over and over again would be less painful if the fighting were a bit more enjoyable. Moving the Penitent One about just feels kind of laborious. The controls work well, it just feels so slow and heavy. I suppose that makes sense, given the fact that he's wearing a bunch of armor and has 80 pounds of steel on his head, but it's a video game and it feels lethargic to me. Taking damage from an enemy only solidifies the sluggishness of your character as he lumbers back to his feet. I know that one can avoid getting hit by blocking correctly, but sometimes the goal is just to get back to your corpse for the 10th time and patience is wearing thin. You really can't run and gun too much here, and since you can't jump over most of the enemies, you have to fight them, which takes time if you don't want to take damage. As such, it takes a while to get anywhere you want to go because of the generally slow flow of the game. This can be a tad torturous if you are confused about where to go next. There are a bunch of side quests and lots of lore found in Custodia, but a lot of it is kind of cryptic and unclear. Not nearly as bad as Castlevania 2, but confusing nonetheless. Maybe it has something to do with the item names. Everything sounds like it came out of a D&D campaign. They have things like the Cord of the True Bearing, Blood Perpetuated in Sand, or Ember of the Holy Cremation. How about some dried flowers bathed in tears? Good lord. Forgive me, but this starts to seem a little silly after a while. Almost like the game is trying too hard and is taking itself too seriously. There's lots of lore too. Most items have a little background to them. That's a nice touch, but I'm just not too interested. After making your way through the hordes of deformed baddies and disfigured bosses, the player faces off against the final boss, His Holiness Escribar. I'm still not sure why we're fighting this guy, but I guess it doesn't really matter. His initial form is pretty easy. He leaves himself wide open for a beating in between his little magic attacks. But of course, then he transforms into his true form, the last son of the miracle. You need to hit the sword in the eye 3 times before his face opens up for attack. This boss really isn't all that hard. Just be sure to watch the ground for those big energy blasts and be sure to knock away the green bulbous projectiles. After hitting him in the face with your sword a bunch of times, the fight ends. Here's Deogracias again, narrating as an act of penance. And dude, can you just not do that right now? It's the very end of the game, but Deogracias has an itch, so he's gonna scratch. Oh well. Nothing left to do now but run up this hill and watch the game end. There are 2 different endings to Blasphemous, and it seems we got the bad one. You will note that Deogracias has refrained from grabbing at his groin just long enough to retrieve our head and place it with all the others. So what do we have to do to get the good ending? Apparently, and this doesn't sound confusing at all, first we need to equip the Immaculate Bead, one of the rosary items, then die 3 times. 1, 2, and 3. Now we need to find and destroy all of those guilt-absolving statues that I never talked about. Then enter the red circles and beat the challenge rooms for each. And lastly, knock out the last boss again. No problem. Okay. Trudging up the hill again and... So the good ending consists of the protagonist committing suicide. Heartwarming stuff. Let's do some pros and cons, and I think I'm ready for a shower after all this.
Okay, some pros.
Though presented in pixelated form, the environments, monsters, and especially the bosses look great. Highly detailed and clean, the game's visuals are as polished as chunky pixels get. The controls are responsive, and you really only have yourself to blame when you die. The buttons are mapped well, and you're going to have to use them all. I sometimes would dodge when I wanted to block, or vice versa, but that's my own fault. The sound and music are done well. The music isn't overbearing and exists softly in the background, favoring strings over percussion. Though not exactly memorable, it exists when necessary and fades out when not. The combat is really this game's selling point. It takes the combat very seriously. Enemies can take you down pretty quickly for not paying suitable attention. The game is well polished. It's obvious that a lot of hard work went into creating this title. From the menu and lore to the speech of the NPCs, the game is all tied together well thematically. Okay, how about a couple of cons? Let's see. As is custom for games of this genre, the player is left to figure things out at their own rate. Usually this seems liberating, but here, for whatever reason, I had trouble figuring out where to go next, or what to do with new quest items. And the item names and alternate terminology for everything just adds to the confusion. While your character does get stronger throughout the game, there is nothing in this area that really sets this game apart from others. Your health bar gets bigger, so does your fervor, but you only get a couple new abilities with your sword, and those can only be upgraded. There's nothing much more beyond hitting harder and taking more hits. I really hate falling onto spikes. I can understand if I made the mistake of misjudging a jump and I land in spikes, but what really burns my biscuits is when I get hit by an enemy and forced into spikes. This game definitely plays more like Castlevania than Metroid when it comes to stuff like this. While the visuals are well done and creative, some of the level designs can be rather boring. Trudging down identical hallways becomes tedious, especially when you see the same enemies over and over again in the same places. The repetitiveness also adds a bit to sensory confusion, forcing you to check your map more than you may want to. And speaking of maps, no mini-map? Come on! There isn't some kind of item with a weird name that grants the player a mini-map? Like the seared sheepskin of Cartographer's Anguish or something? That would help. Lastly, and maybe it's just me, but playing through the game was somewhat unnerving. Just the idea of existing in the type of world portrayed in the game makes me uncomfortable. No thanks. But that being said, Blasphemous is a good game. Not a great game, but good. I think this is only the developer's second title, which usually means their best stuff is still on the horizon.
Thank you for watching this all the way through. If you enjoy stuff of this nature and would like to see more in the future, please like this video and subscribe to this channel so as to be informed when new videos are added.